This is a very special concert because it's not really a concert, right? We do have storytelling, but this is our first poet, and we're honored to have Tony here. And I had an idea because a friend of ours, Karen, said that there was a poem written for Tony by our own poet laureate, Susan Allison. And she had an idea of maybe reading this, and I thought, well, this would be a perfect introduction. So, as I'm not going to be too dramatic, but I'm going to read this poem. It's called To Tony Connor, and it says, after hearing you read at the Brightwood, you are the sorcerer's apprentice who got the broom to cooperate. You knew the lines and the loops of the spells so intimately you could see yourself, the broom and the sweeping in one impeccable design. The sorcerer returned and searched for unseen clues as you youthfully leapt further into greater incantations. The plumber's hand, the unruly smoke like continuous lodgers ascending. You ruddy-cheeked and sorcerer now swept us all off of our feet.
Thank you. This is the first reading I've given for 2 years, I think. The last one I gave was at Baylor University in Texas, and the only reason I agreed to do it was because I was interested to visit Waco. Entirely because I wanted to see where the Branch Davidians had been massacred and where 2 motorcycle gangs had fought it out on a parking lot outside Bed Bath & Beyond. That was quite an interesting trip. However, I grew up a very long way from Waco, Texas, and indeed from Middletown, Connecticut. I grew up in an industrial city in the north of England, most of the time during the Second World War and after it, when it was a very broken down and somewhat dismal place, although I had a very enjoyable childhood. And I suppose although I left school at 14, I was rather well educated by the BBC, and by the Sunday school I attended, and by the local library. But it strikes me that not only the dust of books, but the dust of the streets affected me a lot. And in those days, the streets were very busy with people. For one thing, there'd been severe petrol rationing all through the war and afterwards, so there were few cars about. And also, there were lots and lots of children playing out in the street before the years of television, of course. And so as much as I was affected by things like popular songs and so forth, I was also affected by the rhymes and chants that children used to sing as they jumped rope and skipped and ran about and bounced and so on. In fact, one of the first things I wrote was a bouncing song. So this is a child's bouncing song. And it has sometimes been mistaken for an anonymous poem since then, to my pleasure, but actually I wrote it. And it's I'm interested in technical matters, not that any of you are, but it's written in, most English verse is written in what they call the iambic meter, which is di-dur, 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 di-dur. But there's also a more unusual meter called trochaic, which is da-dur, 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 da-dur. And this is written in trochaic verse. Molly Vickers wets her knickers. George's father's big and black. Cream on Sunday, milk on Monday. I'm the cock of all the back. Tell me who's a bigger boozer. Mr. Baker beats them all. From his lorry, watch him hurry. Touch the ground and touch the wall. Who are the gentry down our entry? Mrs. Smith's got 2 TVs. What if her coat is a fur coat? All her kids are full of fleas. Joan loves Harry. Jack will marry Edna when they both grow up. I'll announce it. Bounce, bounce, bounce it. Our dog Whiskers had a pup. High and low and to and fro and down the street and up the hill, Mrs. Cuthbert's husband snuffed it. She got nothing from his will. Mr. Shirley's sister won a prize on Blackpool prom. Mamm'll smother our kid brother when the school inspectors come. Skip and hopping, I'm off shopping. Tuesday night, it's chips for tea. Please to take this ball and make this song of bouncing song for me. The only unusual reference in there is Blackpool prom. Blackpool is a seaside resort up in the north of England, very popular with working class. And the promenade has a kind of linear Coney Island on it. And Blackpool also has a tower like the Eiffel Tower, but not so big. So I grew up in this place. The streets were very Dickensian when I look back on it. It had all been built in the middle of the 19th century. It was up and down and round, a maze of cobbled streets. And the horizons were very close horizons. And the people hardly ever went anywhere unless they got a bus. They became well acquainted with the things immediately around them. And I could see that pattern in my own life, that I tend to take what's close at hand. So the earliest poems I wrote were all about things that were nearby. And this poem is a poem, well, a kind of description of the street and the area in which I lived. Although, like most of my poems, it's also about the very act of writing poetry. One is wondering about what one is doing as one does it. And this one, the area had a number of what you would call vacant lots, which were known as crofts. And on these vacant lots, some of them were where houses had fallen down or been removed, or they were there for whatever reason. People would tip all kinds of rubbish. The area was a real slum by modern American standards. And on this croft, all sorts of things had been tipped, old umbrellas and broken bikes and so on. There was even an old mattress which had burst where the interior, the kapok had burst out. And in fact, in the last stanza of this, that is my image of God. Obviously, by that time, I was asking all kinds of questions about divinity. Right. The croft, shadowed between houses, blotchy with grass like fading bruises, had hardly ground to be called croft, being no more than an unclaimed cleft in a grubby, once stately row of 4 window fronts done in stucco. Shut like a world in a glass ball, this is where childhood befell whatever it is that stepped on into my moving imagination. Name, purpose, family face were vivid daydreams of that place, where, ear cocked to the sour earth and the scavenging rats scratch beneath in caved cellars, my mind embodied populous otherwheres to be studied. A god who, if he cared to come, might broken glass-top wall that kingdom, or, since an old Jew who retailed fish there before his shop was demolished, might sell the burst mattress, the frames of bike and umbrella, and the bones buried by dogs, even the mind that summoned him from the back of the wind. The real abides, the poem finds it. By instinct, cat or dog wit of sniff and sixth sense, the poem follows its own secret way home. Time that had shored crumbles. The years, their accreted populous otherwheres vanish, and I alone am left, I and the poem and the croft, too close for distinction. Rats beneath scurry and squeak. From his burst mouth the ever-present God speaks, innocuous rhetoric of wet kapok. When I look back on it, I don't think I know what I was talking about. In fact, you know, Robert, somebody once asked Somebody once asked the poet Robert Browning what he meant by words in a certain early poem of his called Sordello, and he looked at it and studied it and held it all ways up. And then he said, well, when I wrote that, only God and Robert Browning knew, and now only God knows. I mean, I actually looked up this afternoon. I thought, I wonder what I meant by summoned him from the back of the wind. So I looked up back of the wind on Google and other places, and I was none the clearer there. Talking about. Yes. So that was the croft. The next one is also about one of the places rather nearby. And here again, this is a poem about what it is to be a poet. What purpose does the poet serve? Where does he stand in society? What's his relationship to the place he lives in, and so forth. And this touches upon things like that. I made elaborate charts showing me the pages, and I forgot to put where that one was, so I've got to look it up if you'll excuse me for a moment. Where is it? 76, okay. Yes, just not too far away from where I lived. As I say, it was the middle of a big industrial city, but there was one area where the land fell away and nobody had ever been able to build anything on it. Well, the Victorians had tried to build rather elaborate mansions and things, but gradually they'd all subsided and they were all unoccupied amongst trees and briars and all kinds of undergrowth and so on. And this was quite spectacular. In the middle of the city, there was this area of rural kind of, wasteland with the range of these houses. And down below was another part of the city began, and you could see the rest of the city in the distance mistily. And down below there was a race course with a big dirty river flowing through it. So I was on there. I used to go walking there among all the trees and brambles and the disarray and everything. But this poem, you see, like many poems, isn't quite what it appears to be, because it begins between the scented soap works and cloud-capped cooling towers. Well, anybody who was reading it carefully or who remembered things they had read before would immediately remember the most famous cloud-capped towers in English literature, which are the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, which is from the Tempest, which Prospero speaks to out of the Tempest. And it struck me, in fact, that the only cloud-capped towers I've ever seen in my life were the towers of the power station down below this thing. These big concave towers with smoke or something coming out of the top of them. And I thought, that's remarkable. These are actually cloud-capped towers. And what's more, even though this soap works isn't a gorgeous palace, it has the most remarkable fragrance all around it, like the perfumes of Arabia. So he's starting in this peculiar place between these two visions of poetry, and you might guess that the poem is going to be about things like that, apart from anything else. Between the scented soap works and cloud-capped cooling towers, I walked one summer evening, swishing the soot-stained flowers. Below, the black river snaked around the racecourse, drudging to distant sea the dregs of commerce. And huge across my vision, under the streaky sky from Chapel Reach to Pomona Dock, the changing city lay, swarming invisibly with its intricate, restless hordes of common humanity, the keepers of the word. All I have accepted to exercise heart and wit, the unpredictable home of the ever unlikely poet. There on the shifting cliff where nothing built will stand, local eruption of a fault that runs across England, I watch the lights come on and listen to a lover coaxing a silent girl under near cover, and farther off the yells of children at some chase, voices much like my own, the accent of the place. The accent of the place, my claim to a shared load of general circumstance with the hidden multitude. Yet, strange, despite the wish, because my chosen task was the making of poems, I shivered in the dusk, aware that my shining city did not care one jot for me as its celebrant, or whether I wrote or not. I might have been unborn or else long dead. But before I reached my home, I had perfected the sociable, lonely poet, a rueful one-man sect in an ignorant, ugly city, his God-given subject. And that still kind of interests me in a way, to think that an ignorant, ugly city I should consider my God-given subject. And all through the poem there are these contrasts between high and low, and scented soapworks and cap cooling towers and so forth. Many years afterwards, in fact only a few years ago, the BBC moved one of its units up to this city, Salford, which was a sister city of Manchester. And somebody from there rang me and said, we're going to do a little celebration of this. Have you got a poem which is about this city? And the only one I could find referred to it as an ignorant, ugly city. So, of course, I didn't wish it upon them. And just as I used things which were nearby, places that were nearby, I used people who were nearby. And one of my early poems was one that has been reproduced all over the place about an old plumber called Elegy for Alfred Hubbard. In fact, an American critic once said to me, that poem has been plagiarized by a number of American poets. So I said, oh, that's really interesting. Who are they? He said, well, I'm in a hurry. I'll tell you next time I see you. And I never saw him again. So maybe he was right. Hubbard is dead, the old plumber. Who will mend our burst pipes now? The tap that has dripped all the summer, testing the sink's overflow. No other like him. Young men with knowledge of new techniques and theories from books may better his work straight from college, but who will challenge his squint-eyed looks in kitchen, bathroom, under floorboards, rules of thumb which were often wrong, seek as erringly stopcocks in cupboards, or make a job last half as long? He was a man who knew the ginnels, alleyways, streets, the whole district. Family secrets, minor annals, time-honoured fictions fused to fact. 70 years of gossip muttered under his cap, his tufty thatch, so that his talk was slow and clotted, hard to follow, and too much. As though nothing fell, none vanished, and time with a maze of Cheetham Hill, in which the dead, with jobs unfinished, waited to hear him ring the bell. For much he never got round to doing, but meant to when weather bucked up or worsened, or when his pipe was drawing, or when he'd finished this cup. I thought time he forgot so often had forgotten him, but here's death's pomp over his house, and by the coffin the son who will inherit his blow lamp, tools, workshop, cart and cornet, pride of Cheetham Prize Brass Band. And there's his mourning widow, Janet, stood at the gate he'd promised to mend. Soon he will make his final journey, shaved and silent, strangely trim, with never a pause to talk to anybody. How arrow-like for him. In St. Mark's Church, whose dismal tower he pointed and painted when a lad, they will sing his praises amidst flowers, while somewhere a cellar starts to flood, and the housewife banging his front door knocker is not surprised to find him gone, and runs for Thwaite, who's a better worker, and sticks at a job until it's done. Again, you know, that seems as though it's just about an old character, but in fact it's quite literary in some places. I noticed years later that I keep myself out of this poem, almost, but when I enter it to say, I thought time he forgot so often had forgotten him. And that is an echo of something in Shakespeare's Richard II, where towards the end of his life, Richard says, I wasted time and now doth time waste me. Very similar to, I thought time had forgotten him, you know. Another interesting thing about the poem is that it tells you something about the fictions that writers engage in, because Hubbard wasn't dead. And, I thought, well, he might be offended if he finds out this poem, but one drunken night at some party he did find out, and he was quite pleased. But then, many, many years later, and of course he wasn't an old man at that time. I was quite young, so I thought somebody about 57 was old. And 20 years later, he was still going. And I think he was still going 30 years later. And quite late in his life, when he was getting a bit gaga, his son told me that the father had said to him one day, when did I die? And I wondered whether I contributed to his confusion by writing his elegy 30 years earlier.
Was he related to the Hubbards who built this?
No, his name was Hubbard.
Oh.
I changed the name because, as I say, I thought he might be offended. And this is another poem about a person. I mean, one of the fortunate things, when one looks back on one's life, a lot of things which might seem to have been misfortunes at the time turn out to be great good fortune. I think of it as my good fortune that I lived in the house I was born in till I was over 30. And that was really because I failed a very important exam when I was 11. So instead of going on to higher education, I just stayed where I was and was apprenticed to the textile trade when I was 14 and went on living in my mother's house. It was my mother's house because my father had disappeared when I was 5 years old and was never seen again. Again, looking back on it, I now consider that my good fortune because it left me free to find father figures wherever I could. And I found a number of very good ones in my life. However, as I say, I lived in that house till I was over 30, and then I was married and we moved to another part of the city, not very far away. And we lived next door to a remarkable, disreputable old Russian called Konstantin Solovyensky, I think, although he once told me that for some mysterious reason he had taken the Polish version of his name. He didn't tell me why, but anyway, he'd had all kinds of things happen to him in his life, and I admired him a lot. But as I say, he was disreputable, and he kept a disreputable boarding house. All kinds of people living there, some of whom were on the run from the police and so forth. And so he was our next door neighbour across just a short piece of concrete yard, you know. And in fact, I liked him so much that I named my second book after him. And so this is a poem about him. The Russian landlord who lets next door's once carefully cared for rooms to anybody is angry about the money that's gone from his desk. He doesn't mind whores or coloured students or jailbirds or kids. He trails to the bins in a tatty dressing gown, up at 7:30, shaking his aristocratic head at the evil in men. I like sharing the area with him. Revolutions, pogroms, years in a concentration camp haven't made him despair of human nature. He won't call the police, he never does, or tell the suspect to get his cardboard baggage packed. And he isn't liberal-minded. He'll curse rotten the dirty bastard who robbed him and make life unpleasant deliberately for all his tenants for at least a day and perhaps two. But he can't keep it up. He carries his years gaily. A bow tie and the collar of Astrakhan are popular sights in every local bar. And at 63, it's said, he still has charm to enjoy the guarded virtue of good wives who open their legs to nothing else that isn't legal. May I survive a barbarous age as well. Muttering and miming punches under a clear blue sky, he crunches back to the door across the spillage of cinders from his pail. I watch from the kitchen table, where I've sat all night struggling to be a poet in mid-journey at masterful stretch among the rich imperatives of family life. The Russian pauses, staring at me as though my house is haunted, reluctant to believe I'm up at such an hour. He comes worriedly to my window, certain I must be awake because of children. Is it bad sick, your little ones, he asks. I reassure him. They vomited but are asleep again. He beams, who has never heard of Pushkin, and says, it will be a lovely day. And there again. No, please don't clap between poems. It disturbs me. There again, you see, that's about the poem and his relationship to society, certainly with the person next door. And it's somewhat ironic that this person next door has not even heard of his own national poet. He's not at all interested in the fact that his next door neighbour writes poetry. And I suppose many of the people who've been the subject of my poems would not read my poems or anybody else's, which is interesting. I've divided these poems into different categories just for my own amusement, and 2 or 3 here are about people I knew. This is another one written very many years later. Later on, I'll get to poems all written in Middletown and about Middletown. But a lot of the ones that I have written in Middletown, where I've lived actually since 1971, have been based upon memory, you know, and things that happened in the distant past. This is about a young fellow who was an admirer, a hater. He both hated and admired me when I was making a reputation in Manchester, England, and I was appearing on television, and I had achieved a certain amount of fame in that locality and so forth. And he was a young poet who hadn't been able to make anybody listen to him or indeed finish very much. And he became friendly with me, but as I say, at the same time, he kind of hated me because what he hoped to do, I appeared to have already done. I was much better organised than he was, and I wasn't deep sunken in drugs and drink as he was. But nevertheless, I had this relationship with him. I used to lend him money, try to find him jobs and do various things like that. I remember one night when he was drunk, he was somehow or other in my house, and he got hold of a tennis racket and started chasing me with it, trying to flail at me and so forth. So he was a very troublesome person, and I wrote this poem to memorialise him. From the first time he sought me out, I knew he was troubled. He cracked his knuckles and tossed meaninglessness about in long poems he dragged like shackles wherever he went. His eyes shot flares from something in distress and foundering. He soon tried to push me downstairs while I was still naive and wondering what satisfaction he thought he'd find in having me as his acquaintance. I think he needed one of his kind, but free, as it seemed, from his harsh sentence. Sometimes he'd weep with drunken love. Sometimes he'd drool out sullen hatred like stinking ectoplasm. Enough, I'd shout, from an easy selfhood battered by accusations I knew from dreams, as often hurled by my own demons. His conversation, poor in themes, was rich in dark hints and disastrous omens. And now he's dead, his ex-wife writes, run down on a country road in Flintshire by a person unknown one dark midnight. The coroner's verdict, misadventure. I'd long since banished him from my life, stopped writing him checks and recommendations. He'd threatened me with more than a knife, more than his failures, more than unruly passions. So I ought to be glad to know for sure that never again will he ever find me, that I'll never meet him at my door or turn to see him scowling behind me. But I harbour the fear that, body free, his painful spirit, ever seeking impossible balm, will light on me and settle in my house, sour and grave mocking. Now, as I say, I got married and moved across that same city and, of course, wrote a number of poems to the woman I married, only two of which I'll read to you, actually. This, of course, times change. My God, how they do change. When we first got married, we had I don't think we probably used the local laundromat or laundrette, as they called it then, but we hadn't got a dryer. And I remember one night, I used to stay up at night, partly because I could look after the children in the middle of the night and my wife could get some sleep, but I also wrote at night and sometimes tried to write right through the night. And this was one of those occasions when she'd gone to bed and left me to get on with my writing. But because there was no dryer, wet washing was spread over every surface, all the chairs and tables and everything like this, which prompted me to write this poem. Composed of shadows and damp clothing, the setting you have left for me to write my poems in, having yourself taken to bed, is witness of your deft devotion to my downfall. I must be all for you, loving or loathing, and either a full-time job. You crave every preoccupation, detail of thought not being your care, provided you are there. Surely tonight of all nights when passion has heaved bodily overboard any suspicions we had that the other gave less than we gave ourselves, you might have left me to do my writing unencumbered by this array, the evidence of your wash day, whose very shadows, jutting, butting, menace my desk and hand, familiars of your sleep, daring me to write of anything but you. This token of servitude, then, a poem made in your image, despite my wish to spend these night hours as though this hearth and home knew none but me, a state in which not the slightest whisper of you need ever be spoken. And then one from much, much later on, written in Middletown, in fact, many, many years later, but still one of a couple of poems called The Memories of Marriage. I suppose we had what you might call an adversarial relationship with each other, which lasted for about 10 years. 10 very, very interesting years, I might say. Very exciting years. So this is also an incident this is called a provocation and happened very early on in this marriage. I was kneeling by the grate building our earliest fire when you crept up on cat's feet and with one swift motion poured a jugful of cold water over my prim composure. Ah, those were honeymoon days when ravenous love and hate subverted civilities. I glared through dripping wet and blustered of rough justice the next time you dared try it. Then did nothing of the sort, being phlegmatic and shy and in awe of your upstart wifeliness, a new country where I was lost and found out, poured on and blessed with blue sky. State I earned banishment from, but that's a more sombre tale. Now I salute our first home and praise your ungentle role in fostering the freedom that forced me into exile. Now, I thought, moving on from there, it's reasonable enough to read you poems. I've written poems about each of my children, 2 sons, 1 daughter. And this is the first of them. This was my eldest son. Again, written a long time ago when he was a little boy. The BBC recently had a poll to discover when people were at their happiest, and the answer was when the children were little. Page 63, where is it? It says it's on page 63, but it isn't.
On top.
Yeah, how do you get that on?
Where is it, Bobby? Oh, I see it.
Thanks, yeah.
Wonderful.
Right, so let me find where this one is. What's it called? Waking, page 63. Well, I've written down the wrong name. I've got it. Oh, here it is, 61, not 63. And this actually contains a good deal of wish fulfillment, because at the end it kind of segues into I'm thinking of myself as a small child and rushing downstairs to a father who will, you know, show me affection and so forth, whereas I don't remember any of that. Anyway. The incubus of nightmare is on my chest, squeezing the rib cage in. What beast squats on its haunches, face to mine, waiting for me to wake and open eyes like an owl's, so close are his. I lie sweating eternities of clouded fears away until, hearing the milkman ring the bell, I know the customary world awaits beyond my darkness. The incubus fits a sticky finger into my nose to find out where the nostril goes. It is my eldest son, no worse, 2 years commander of this universe. An incubus which babbles daddy over the pouchy, aging body which surely should be small as his is small, and should be racing downstairs to the kitchen fire, and a huge man who laughs and laughs and says, "Hello, son." So as I say, really, that's something that didn't happen to me, or I don't remember it happening to me. That son went much farther in his adventures than up my nostril. Finished up in international development, working all over the world. And then I wrote one to my other son, who was a year younger. Where is that one? 73. Yes, and this one has actually been reproduced a lot. And this is an interesting poem, if only, to me, for one thing, it's the only last line I have ever been given. So the last line was the first thing I had, and I'd got to think, how the hell am I going to get down to this last line? And it's because of that last line that the poem takes the rather peculiar, meandering form that it does. It's called A Child Half Asleep. Stealthily parting, I should tell you, in the middle of the poem there is an image of a dummy dangling. That's the British name for a pacifier, you know, and you would put a safety pin and it's on the end of a string so it can find it when it's asleep. Stealthily parting the small hour's silence, a hardly embodied figment of his brain comes down to sit with me as I work late, flat-footed, as though his legs and feet were still asleep. He sits on a stool, staring into the fire, his dummy dangling. Fire ignites the small coals of his eyes. It stares back through the holes into his head, into the darkness. I ask what woke him. A wolf dreamed me, he says. Well, the reason why the poem took its entire character from that last line, which is what he said to me, a wolf dreamed me, I immediately knew that he was getting mixed up and he meant I've dreamed of a wolf. But nevertheless, it immediately reminded me of that Hindu legend in which the entire universe is dreamed into being in the mind of Vishnu. And I thought, that's a difficult enough concept to get hold of, but to be dreamed into existence in the mind of a dumb beast, how much stranger. So I knew that the poem was going to be about states of being and the mystery of being. That's why the child emerges, as it were, from nowhere, or I imagine the small hours' silence as being like huge, heavy curtains stealthily parting the small hours' silence. And of course, he is just a hardly embodied figment of his brain because he's just coming out of sleep. And the fire at that time, of course, again, in the past would have been a coal fire. So when I say fire ignites the small coals of his eyes, it's as if the coals in the fire are being reflected in his eyes, but they go right back into the brain, into his head, into the darkness where all things are imagined into being. And then we get down to the last line, ask what woke him. A wolf dreamed me, he says. And then I wrote a poem about my daughter, but I didn't write that till many, many, many years later. And in fact, I didn't get round to her until she was approaching puberty. And this poem actually takes place in Middletown because by that time, we'd long since moved here. And this is called A Picture of R.C. in a Prospect of Blossom. And again, you might think the poem is just about my daughter, but in fact, it harks back to a poem written in the 17th century by the English poet Andrew Marvell, which is called A Picture of Little T.C. in a Prospect of Stone. T.C., my very initials, you know. So it wasn't difficult to model this one after it and call it A Picture of R.C., Rebecca Connor, in a Prospect of Blossom. And of course, you know, I'm told that the trees that we call magnolias round here are not really magnolias. They don't have that heavy scent that you get in the south. There's some related species, but they do drop their beautiful blossoms even before the leaves come out. The whole ground beneath is covered with these bright blossoms, which is where the last image comes from in this poem. In the still, warm air of afternoon, you stand beneath the magnolia tree watching the blossoms fall. Your face upturned is secret as the moon, bland in the blue, though hours too soon. A petal descends with deathly grace, another lies on your arm, I see. It is your 11th spring, and yet your first because you feel it so. Never before such scents to smell, never such drenching, slippery sweat, such bird song, or such flowers to pet. You run from the house, whose wintry spell still mutters of storms and ice and snow, to skip barefooted on the grass, or jump from favourite stone to stone, or else sit solemn on the stoop, watching the link-arm lovers pass, as if they held some magic glass in which came shimmering into shape scenes of your future fully grown. And now, What silent reverie holds you with bated thought and breath beneath the surprising moon, among the flakes of blossom still breaking free and the fallen abundance of the tree? I see you standing, statue strong and tiptoe deep in brilliant death. And again, you make a lot of things up because the nearest tree of that kind to me is in Court Street, I think, which is a mile from where I lived. I never remember seeing my daughter beneath it, but for the sake of the poem, I placed her there. So those are the three that I wrote, as I say, about my children. Now, also, of course, not much to write about my father because I didn't know him. But nevertheless, when I was 25, how long am I supposed to go on, by the way?
As long as you want.
Till my voice begins to croak. I didn't know him, but no sooner had he died than we heard from some distant relative that he was dead. And he died in a very strange place on the only British possession ever under Nazi occupation during the Second World War, the Channel Islands. He died on the biggest of these islands, Jersey. And I had to go there as the next of kin, because my mother had divorced him some years earlier, in the middle of winter to this tourist island and attend to his... He had gone, he was beneath the earth by the time I got there, so I never got the chance even to see his dead body. And I did think that I might have found a few clues to my own tastes and general intellectuality, but in fact all he'd left behind was a broken rosary, beads and some pulp cowboy novels and things like that. One of the things I found, however, was his walking stick, what Americans call a walking cane, of course. And that did get me to write a poem about it. He was, of course, I only ever really got my mother's account of what he was like, and she was prejudiced, obviously. She used to say he was a liar and a swindler and all kinds of things like that. Swindler, con man and embezzler are a few of the roles my father played. Declared a bankrupt in 1932, he opened a radio shop in my mother's name, forging her signature to save time and trouble. She was the only daughter among a pack of lads, the last at home when he met her. She and a widowed mother in a well-kept house. No wonder his lodger's eye brightened towards the ageing girl. Soon my grandma was baking him meat pies, calling him son. It must have seemed a good arrangement to all concerned. He, with the urge to procreate that visits philandering men after years of contraceptives, but no homemaking instinct, found a home already made. My mother, fiercely dutiful, thought she could add a husband to what existed. My grandma imagined daughter and self provided for. Perhaps there was love too. I can't answer for that. Although my mother, even at 69, is a sucker for silver-tongued men. Snapshots show him in a cap with a big neb, his arm around her on a boat to the Isle of Man. Both are smiling 3 months before my birth. Later, there's one of her in a laughing pose next to the backyard dustbin. Taken by him, it looks affectionate, as though he'd said as he clicked the shutter, "Let's have it backwards rowed about tonight." But my mother's fervent legal honesty must have shocked him. Out of bed, he couldn't persuade her to accept his improvisations. When angry creditors and detectives called, she jibbed at saying, "I'm sorry, he's gone to business on London." According to their different lights, they let each other down badly. I was 5 when he disappeared with a royal warrant out for his arrest. None of us saw him again, but 20 years on, incredibly breaking silence, came news of his distant death. Among his belongings, the woman he'd lived with had them in a cardboard grocery box ready for me to claim or reject. I found a stout walking stick, thinking it apt that, having been without support from him for so long, my mother should have something of him to lean on at last. I carried it home 300 miles under my arm. Her comment was flat, but had an edge I couldn't name. Put it in the hall stand. There it has stood, unused to this day. Of course, I know a lot more about my mother and her life than about my father, because I was brought up by this strong woman. My mother, who of course was left there in the 1930s with no means of support. She didn't feel as though she could go back to her full-time job as a secretary because she got 2 little kids. So she took in other people's washing and cleaned other people's houses and did all kinds of things. And so we were rather poor and so on. And then later on, she took in lodgers, only one at a time because we didn't live in a big house. But nevertheless, all through my childhood, these men, they were all men, came and went through the house. And many of those people were very good to me, this little fatherless boy. However, as I say, my mother was by herself, and I wrote poems about her. One of the things, her life was one of these lives dreadfully interrupted by 2 world wars. When the first one began, she was, well, let me tell you, here's this poem. And the world I grew up in was full of single women, maiden ladies, as they were called, because all the men were killed in the First World War. 1 million British and Commonwealth troops were killed in the First World War. 1 million. 60,000 of them on the morning of the first day of the Battle of the Somme. In fact, I would urge everybody to watch this remarkable reconstruction that's just been made of First World War footage called They Shall Not Grow Old. It's truly remarkable. It's as if all these moving pictures have been taken yesterday, beautifully colorized and so forth. Anyway, as I say, there are many of these maiden ladies about, and they used to go to spiritualist churches trying to get in touch with the dear departed, you know. And these spiritual churches, most of them were metal huts in back streets and so forth. And one makes all kinds of attempts to say where one came from and why, whether as a human being or more particularly as a poet, and I suppose this is one of my attempts. When the First World War began, my mother was 21, dreaming of marriage, no doubt, and the love that went with it. By the time the war ended, everything had gone bad. Slouching back, blank-eyed, hot-groined came the wounded, mad and stunned, babbling of dead men, or mute as the corpse of a best mate. 10 years later, she married one of the walking wounded, whose heart was a no man's land, whose thoughts, rats gnawing a hand. He gave her 2 kids and then abandoned the position. Perhaps I was nothing more than a souvenir of war, some long withheld remembrance exchanged in the sexual dance. Miss Butcher, Miss Briggs, Miss Mew, Miss Henderson, Miss O'Shea found no one to take the place of the man who blew a kiss from a start-jolting troop train, Harry, Bert, Alf, Arthur, John. Less lucky than my mother, who at least found a father for her imagined children. They boarded or lived alone nearby the house I grew in, patient, waiting for a sign. Talk often turned to the dead in those dismal days I played happily through, and voices death spoke from moving glasses and the unmoving, tranced mouths of mediums, lies or truths to dignify hopelessness. My mother returned breathless one night, Miss O'Shea bright-eyed and serious by her side. Both were full of the séance. A message had come through Hans, the grumpy Danish control. Tell Doll I am alive still, everlastingly alive in the land of divine love, where flowers bloom everywhere and there is no pain. Arthur. They chattered across my head while I planned an action, led soldiers with bayonets fixed, row upon row, newly unboxed. Yes, so I mean, the First World War cast a very, very long and dark shadow over my childhood. And then, before you knew what was happening, another one had begun. In fact, the next poem refers to that, my mother again. By the time the Second World War got going, she was about 48. And in fact, I have it in this poem. I was about 48 when I wrote this poem. And the song that she's singing in this poem is a well-known song that was from the First World War. There's a long, long trail a-winding into the land of my dreams where the nightingale is singing and the bright moonbeams. I don't know whether anybody remembers that. We used to have a boiler in the cellar. It was like a kind of big open vat, and a fire was lit beneath it, and my mother would boil the bedding and stuff like that in there. So the house was full of steam on certain days of the week. And she used to refer to these. In fact, a few weeks ago, I was looking through my photographs and memorabilia and things, and I found some postcards sent from the front in the First World War to my mother, Dolly, as they called her then. And on one of them, there was a message on the back from a soldier at the front, written in spidery pencil. And my daughter said, "Why did they write in pencil?" And I then thought, well, of course, there were no big pens then. In fact, you wouldn't have carried a fountain pen either if you were going into battle, so the pencil was the thing you used. But on one of them was written in my mother's own hand, "Poor Will died of wounds, Rion, such and such a date, 1916. And she used to sometimes tell me about these different men, and she'd say, "Oh, he was a lovely young man." My mother sang, "There's a long, long trail a-winding into the land of my dreams," and steam came drifting up with the song from the cellar boiler she stood over, filling rooms and corridors with odour of wet washing. Her Monday chore took hours and hours. Sometimes she was still at it downstairs when I arrived home for tea, water sloshing and dull rhymes thumping, where the nightingale is singing and the bright moon beams. The songs were always from the trenches of Passchendaele and the Somme, where the young men she might have married became corpses she couldn't mourn. Now, over 20 years later, she had been long abandoned by the stunned survivor who gave her 2 children, and there was another war to end war, and she took in washing, and no young man dreamed of her as he dozed in a dugout. But she was fit and strong, and who could say what was fair or what life was all about? I'm putting thoughts into the head that sings in my head. A man the age she was then. In truth, I will never know why she sang, and she is dead like all her lovely young men. I better take a drink of water now and pause a moment. I can tell my voice is going to go. I should have done what actors do and limber up beforehand. But it's so long since I've done this that I forgot that was necessary to do some vocal exercises. So I'll just give myself a little rest if anybody wants to ask me anything. you do it. And of course, it's of great interest to me if one of the things that I like doing is using very intricate verbal patterns. So all these poems that I'm reading you have very, very intricate verbal patterns in them, which it's my pleasure to completely disguise, so that I'm the only one who knows that I'm using them. And this, I suppose, is the art that conceals art, as they say. Even that one I've just read is in lines, each of which contains exactly 7 syllables, no more and no less. And it's also rhymed or half rhymed, so that you don't know that it's there. What then?
Who's your most influential English poet of the 20th century? And
Well, you know, I read very, very widely when I was young, and there are all kinds of people I was influenced by. You know, I mean, anybody who wishes, well, I mean, as time passes, there are all kinds of people today who wish to make an immediate impact and are performative, people who call themselves performance poets, whose work really only needs hearing, and other people like rappers who obviously perform. And in reading these poems to you, I'm really performing, well, if I am performing at all, I'm performing some trickery, because none of them at all was written for public performance. When I wrote them, I invariably write poems late at night in a quiet room, and even though I say them to myself, they take me a long time to write, and I reconstruct them again and again and again, sometimes over weeks. So these are old-fashioned poems that require reading and mulling over as well as listening to. So in that way, I'm an old-fashioned poet, and when I was learning to be a poet, I just read everything I could. I wished to be part of a very long tradition. So I read right back beyond Shakespeare and Chaucer and everybody else. So I've been influenced by many people.
you don't have any favorites you go back to?
Oh yeah, but you get, the more you read, the more you become aware of what different people are doing and how many clever ways they do it, you know, so you admire a lot of things. I thought the next little section I would read, most of my poems arise out of my private life. But of course the private life and the public life are constantly intersecting in the modern world, and none of us can escape politics, and I haven't done either. So I thought I would read you 3 poems which are somewhat political, but also other things as well. 95, let me see. This poem was written in the middle of one of the most troubled periods in American history, in the 1960s. And it's obviously about kind of how one survives troubled times, and it sets against troubled times something that might be imagined as the permanence of art or the long-lastingness of art. It's called Listening to Bach in Franklin County. 1968 actually was the time when I wrote it. You remember what a ferment was going on then. The police in the cities prepare for summer. There is much talk of the need for order. A fugue in the wilderness ravishes the hearts of a few impotent men. With lunatic fastidiousness, the music steps from my window towards the scrub forest before and the shopping plaza behind, inviting assassination, such fervent benevolence open to the night air. It all happens again. The just go down, the greedy, the stupid. Battlefields become the pastures of scholars. One thinks of ways to preserve one's sanity, fuse whose structure one only senses, a political sticker on the windshield that partly obscures one's vision, the forfeiture of giant miseries to write a small poem at midnight. I was looking at that the other day, wondering why I didn't say a political decal on the windshield, and I thought maybe the word decal had not been invented then. I didn't know it anyway. So then one that comes, I mean, I have travelled quite widely, somewhat to my surprise, and I was in Hungary a good deal during the later years of communism, when stringencies were disappearing, and I mean, they were beginning to let 1,000 flowers bloom and so forth, but nevertheless it still was communism. And one day I was asked to go to a garden party at the house of a great poet, and the person who invited me, a Hungarian friend of mine, explained to me that this man, of course, wasn't a great poet. He was just a poet who was a lackey of the administration. He was somebody who the communist government approved of. So they'd given him a Dakar and he got every good thing and so forth. And my friend went on to tell me to be careful because among the guests would be a lot of government spies. So I went along to this party, and really I thought to myself, I don't know whether I realised it then, but I certainly realised it by the time I wrote this poem, that if you willingly give yourself to a situation, you can't really claim separation from it. So if there is deception, you are part of the deception. It was near the Danube, a very beautiful country place. And at that time, the Soviet army was still there. You could see the poor young fellas being led through museums and things at the weekend, looking terribly despondent and fed up, these Soviet troops. Anyway, they were all round Budapest. The Danube glitters and toils just beyond the walnut trees. The great writer sits at ease among blooms and disciples. A garden with an old man, younger men drinking his wine. His voice is slow and benign. The others pause to listen. When he has nothing to say, he smiles and sniffs a pink rose that straggles near his nose. Sometimes he closes one eye. His wife in her painting smock serves us hors d'oeuvres and titbits. She bustles about, then sits to chatter and have a smoke. How idyllic, how humane, I think, testing the thought. For such scenes are dearly bought when foreign troops ring a town. Betrayals may be, and lies, earn them a peaceful old age. Chewing locks, I try to gauge the character of each face. But I don't know the language, and they're all strangers to me. Everybody looks guilt-free, sunlit near the water's edge. I included, it must be, as I stare at the old man like some homage-heavy fan, silenced by proximity. Calmed by thoughts that I too wear the double dealer's false face, I begin to like the place and move out from my corner. With the interpreter's help, I talk of art in the West for a charming poet guest who downs vodka at a gulp. And this one, another political poem, was written in here not so many years ago. In fact, just after the end of the First Gulf War, when the elder George Bush was spouting off rubbish about a new world order and so forth. And I was sitting on my porch one very hot night, and I'd noticed in places like Middlefield, when I walked around, there were American flags flying, and there were more than the usual number of bronze eagles pinned on porches. And then about the same time, I'd been on a trip somewhere or other. I'd flown into somewhere like, I think it was Atlanta in Georgia. And as I came from the plane towards the gate, to my surprise, I saw a horde of people at the gate with banners and balloons and signs saying, "Welcome home, our heroes." And I looked behind me and there were a number of awkward, gangling young men in fatigues advancing towards these people, and these were the heroes who were returning from the Gulf War. And all this stuff was going round in my head. Slumped in a prickly armchair on a humid summer night, I listened dully to dogs barking with brainless pleasure far away and in this street under the victory flags. The bronze eagles with spread wings, flightless on walls and porches, reflected the light from stars as my slow imaginings moved between foreign corpses and these stars and stripes of ours. Sweaty, itching, impotent, I scratched my shirtless shoulder and reached for another beer, like a listless president dreaming a new world order from idle thoughts and hot air. Or like someone long inured to the crafted public lies that lull the popular mind into easy disregard for the coarse realities of imperial command. The heroes were coming home, but not to me in my chair, dogged by barks and disarray. "Welcome," the flags flapped, "welcome. You fought for all we hold dear in the mighty USA." And when I look back on that now, and the way that the dog's barking gets turned into dogged by barks, I wonder if those aren't the dogs of war in this poem. Or I heard a talk in London a couple of years ago about pronunciation in Shakespeare's plays, and it turned out that that was pronounced the dogs of war. Cry havoc and unleash the dogs of war. So that was my attempt at writing. No, not an attempt, but that was my response to a political situation. Now I'm going to read you poems that are all about Middletown, written in Middletown, all about Middletown. But I'll just have to have another little rest for a moment. Well, I've now gone on for 5 minutes, less than an hour. How long do you like these things to go on for?
As long as you like them to.
Right, well, it's best to leave people wanting more, as they say. Still, I've got a number to read here, and as I say, all written in Middletown, about Middletown. The first one is about a house that I often visit, which is where my friends Kathleen and Lisa live. And again, you can't trust these things as fact, you know. You make up things as suits you. I've got one poem in which I have a sister called Claire because I needed a rhyme for something like where. And I didn't have a sister called Claire, but who cares, you know. So this is called At Clover Nook, which is the actual name of the house, which some of you know probably. And this too, if anybody's interested, is written in lines with exactly 7 syllables in them. A bright Sunday afternoon, 2 women I'm fond of who talk of growing children, marriage, divorce, death, love. Cats meow to come in, dogs bark, trees in the yard disperse leaves. One woman makes a wry joke about men's hidden motives. The other, who shares the house, laughs as she grinds coffee, then tells of her early days lap dancing in Miami. Reprehensible but neat, she adds over her shoulder. I nibble a cracker and wait for themes less familiar. The kitchen is visited by a teenage malcontent who butters a piece of bread, silently impertinent, then sidles back whence she came. The women raise their eyebrows, like partners in a board game based on cheating and false throws, but soon return to matters of adult complexity, J's politics, F's tempers, and what to do about tea. They ask my opinion. I offer conflicting thoughts. One mocks me with affection, the other echoes my doubts. And so the afternoon goes until I stand at the door, smoking in leafy shadows between new moon and one star, with the women drinking wine behind me in the lit house, their arguments growing keen, their good humour boisterous. And that, in fact, is dedicated to my friend Lisa. Yeah.
I was never a lap dancer, just so
I told you it. I make it up as I go along. Some years ago, I realised that there were a lot of people in Middletown with whom I was having no social contact whatsoever. And I decided I would do something about it. So I went to work at the soup kitchen. And I worked there 2 lunch hours a week for 20 years until my legs gave out at standing behind the counter. And of course I met all kinds of fascinating people there. And this is a poem about working at the soup kitchen. Most of the time I was out in front, you know, serving the stuff behind the counter. But on this occasion, I was in the back kitchen and the nun had given me a huge barrel of apples to peel and core. And I was doing that as everything was happening around me. If I can find the film. Yeah. It's just called At St Vincent de Paul Place. How did Eddie Frisco die? I inquire of Sister Jill, as she coarse chops celery with a thoughtlessly cheerful expression on her smooth face. I picture a drunken brawl, convulsions or cirrhosis, and drop the wormy apple I'm peeling into the tub with all the other rejects. Sister fingers her earlobe gently, assembling the facts. But no, her eyes are on Dave, who's muttering at the sink about women and lost love, while his unseeing hands plonk stacked dishes and avalanche into the soapy water. Sister walks out from the bench and touches his hunched shoulder, telling him to go and eat. Then she steers him through the door into the dining room's rout. For a moment, I'm left there alone in the bright kitchen, upraised blunt knife in one hand, other hand slow reaching in among donated Cortlands, a sorry, bruised basketful. Brother Paul enters, paddling his huge bulk along with small wrist movements. I'm never wrong, he says. Good meatballs can't fail to please in weather like this. Using a ladle, he tastes the simmering pea soup he's making for tomorrow. Just right, he says, smacking his lips. What would they do without me? His squeaky giggles collapse as Sister Jill walks calmly across to her chopping board and takes up where she left off, as if nothing had occurred. I have had more than enough of my task. The few apples that aren't entirely wormy or rotten require careful sculpting before I can free their good bits for kitchen use. And I can't find a sharp blade. Still, I volunteered for this particular chore. I should stick at it till it's finished. 1:10. Now Skeet arrives, flinging off his top coat, flushed with manic initiatives. Sister quietens him down. Soon she has him scouring out a pasta-encrusted pan, although his legs and big feet jog, trot and sidle strangely, as if fretting to move on to new opportunity. Then suddenly there's action on every side as lunch ends and help invades the kitchen. Raucous voices, clumsy hands. Red Fred, a Puerto Rican with a walleye, a black guy, 2 women dressed like male freaks, and Nancy, who used to screw Hopalong C and Tom Mix in her Hollywood heyday. Washing, drying, carrying, stacking, they get in the way of one another's work, sling friendly insults back and forth, and create such a loud din that Skeet leaves with a mild oath, and Brother Paul, veteran of many kitchen campaigns, retreats to the storeroom where cans, packages and cartons stand ranked in silent order. And there goes the last apple, straight into the reject tub. I stir the modest pan full of salvaged pieces, the job finished except for a few more long squirts of lemon juice. Now I must be on my way up the hill to my office. I'm expecting a student keen to discuss a story she's written, and I wouldn't mind a good cup of coffee before our meeting. Sister's preoccupied on the phone, finger in her other ear against the room's commotion. So I nod to the black guy, skirt the uproar around the sink, and leave without a goodbye. On the main street, a bearded drunk reels from the Arawani, shouting something about God. And I'm back with Eddie Frisco, ignorant of how he died, but picturing him anew, gnarled, hairy, homeless no more, dead. His one motto, fuck the world, tattooed on his grimy forehead. So that was something of my... I wrote a lot of poems about St. Vincent de Paul's. That's just one of them. This is one called Routes to the Liquor Store. They also used to make visits there as well. And this was a particular liquor store next to what is now called the Neon Deli in Cross Street. Not that that matters, except that it took me past a lot of houses on an early evening in summer when I could see into the houses. But again, this is really about, I mean, most poems, maybe most works of art, are about human consciousness and the various ways in which it manages to express itself. And this poem is quite overtly about that, because it starts by talking about how I imagine or fail to imagine the world, or how it shifts about in front of me. In terms roughly understood, misunderstood, and beyond my comprehension, the world continuously imagines new versions of itself in my head. I've been puzzled by the drifts of our loose bond ever since early childhood. Now, settled at 52, I'm impatient for such thoughts, such ways to get through a verse unless they lead me somewhere, like routes to the liquor store, on which I dawdle and pause, brooding on new-made lines taught as high summer's timeless blue, or on people seen at ease through open doors on warm nights when summer is nearly done, survivors of one more day who sprawl in chairs or argue with unseen others, or scan magazines, or switch off lights to stare out at the dark trees. And that's one that's, I mean, a lot of the poems one writes you're no longer interested in. That's one that still interests me, partly because it starts with me in a turmoil, as it were, thinking about my own consciousness. But by the end of the poem, I'm written entirely out of it. It's just people in their houses doing things on a warm night. This one, the next one, is about gardening. At the back of my house, I used to have a lovely plot when I lived in Brainerd Avenue where I could grow really huge tomatoes. And this is really partly about that. But it's also about kind of things bursting with life and things that are dying. There was an old lady who lived up the street. Actually, she lived on Lawn Avenue. She was one of the long-time inhabitants of Middletown. In fact, I was told that her family had been in Middletown for a long, long, long time, to such an extent that outside their house there was a stone with the name of the family incised into it, which was Bacon. And by that time, there were 2 old ladies lived there. And by this time, one of them had had a stroke, I think, and she could only shuffle about with the help of a, what they call in England a Zimmer frame. I think you just call them a walker here. So while I was at the back of the house with a view of the path going to the front, I could see her at the front and I was in among my tomatoes. Some trick of decrepit flesh gives her eyes a death-wise look, a glance from beyond the grave. What such death wisdom might be, I've no idea, of course. In garden terms, evening terms, the terms by which I'm tending my tomatoes, binding here, clipping there, nimble-fingered and keen-eyed to root out weeds and tiny shoots of crabgrass, she leans, crooked, stroke-stricken, on her walking companion at the end of my driveway, a tedious old lady who's always lived on this street. Unwilling to pass me by, it seems, she croaks something down the 30 yards between us, wobbling words gusted away by the ghost of a slight breeze. I wave and smile, still crouching, catching not one syllable. She croaks again, and again I can't hear what she's saying, though I nod understanding and shout, "Glad to see you out." Now I think her silent stare is empty of all judgment, like a newly born infant's. I wish they'd go on their way, she and her companion. Which they do, unseen by me, while I'm rising and twirling, dodging and jumping about to avoid a bumblebee's interest in my bare chest. When I return to the plants, the driveway is deserted. Even though my knee joints hurt, I like crouching near these leaves. Evening brings out their fragrance, and I'm not bothered too much by the cluster of aphids I find under some of them. The many yellow flowers augur a heavy harvest. The plants are healthy and tall, outgrowing my wooden stakes. They'll be great, globous beauties by the laundry basketful before fall's gone. I can taste that ripe fruit flesh already. And now, having read you that one about tomatoes in a great big plot, giant tomatoes they were, growing over 6 feet high and so forth, I'll read you one quite recently. It struck me when I was at Stop and Shop today that they haven't yet got the tomatoes out in front. They've got various flowers, but last year they had these tomato plants there. And so if you live in Middletown, you can even write poems about Stop and Shop. And these plants in pots obviously remind me of when I did it on a large scale. Outside the supermarket for 1995, stand tomato plants in pots, already beginning to thrive. Thick stalks, wide leaves, and many yellow flowers, presaging a heavy harvest for careful growers who'll pamper them in the sunniest spots on patios to be admired from the house or during barbecues by beer-swilling buddies and wine-sipping spouses, hands dreamingly green-fingered by osmosis. But for many years, a sweet leaf tangle surrounded me, and I hummed among ripening fruit whose size dumbfounded me with my ignorant, unforeseen success as a horticulturalist on a patch where I'd buried a dead dog nobody missed. Today, I test a pot's weight, tremble need, arthritic, old age in frail command, entitled and enigmatic. Now, where's my... Oh, there we are. Now, I've just got about 5 more. Shall I read 5 more?
Yeah.
The next one is, again, a Middletown poem. This is about Wadsworth Park, at the entrance to Wadsworth Park. And this is really about the difference between what America was and what America now is. It's about the America of Robert Frost, who wrote about the woods are lovely, dark and deep, and what the woods are like today. And I am in the car park at the entrance with my battered Toyota, and I'm sitting in it, I think, thinking about going in, but realising it's absolutely full of people. The bright bodywork is all the other cars. And the parking lot was full that day. Beyond bright bodywork, trees offer their invitation to enter another world, to make good use of Sundays. Supermarkets are open. The old blue laws were repealed a month before Christmas. But even the secular soul needs some respite from commerce. Or so I tell myself at the sight of a clearing full of cars, wagons and trailers. Usually my weekend walk is a solitary brooding business. All winter the forest has been snowbound or deep in mud. I don't see 10 walkers from November to April ahead of me in the trees. The old poet of New England himself might well have found his dark fancy moved into writing of it. Here is a tumbled wall that once divided properties. There is the grown-over ghost of the road between hamlets, more ghostly still. Here, fruit trees of an abandoned orchard. There, if you search, broken pots from a long-gone farm kitchen. But today is different. It looks as if half the town is inside the forest, bent on enjoying union with nature. Perhaps I should come back tomorrow, I think, irresolutely jiggling the shift stick of my battered Toyota. Nearby, a drunk is aiming a mumbled song at the forest as he weaves between close parked vehicles. And, waddling out from the trees, a fat family arrives back on known ground with squabbles about Wendy's and Hardee's. Now this one is about another nice place, a much, much nicer place to walk in Middletown, which is Guider Farm. And you know, early on in that poem, in one of the first poems I read, there was a metaphorical cat and a metaphorical dog. The poem was said to find its own way home by cat or dog wit. So now I'm going to read you about a real dog and a real cat. This is a poem called With Gus at Guider Farm. Gus was a beautiful big golden retriever that my daughter owned. Now dead, I'm sorry to say. But I used to go walking with him, and I went walking with him on Guider Farm in thick snow once. And But there again, this poem is about other things than that. One of the things it's concerned with is youth and age, the youth of the dog and my age. If I can find it, what number is it? 172. 172. Where is it? Well, it isn't on page 172. So. Well, it'll allow me to get my voice back. Let me see if I can find it in the index. Excuse me a moment. Put the wrong page number down. Oh, well, I can't find it, so I'll read you the one about a cat. This, as I say, is not a metaphorical cat, it's a real cat. In fact, this is a cat that belonged to Kathleen and Lisa, I think, or one or the other of them. And it's, but again, technical matters are of much interest to me as the subject itself. And in this poem, I was intent on using the same word over and over and over again. It's only a short poem, but fortunately the fact the cat happened to be white. Damn it, I can't find anything today. Ah, where is it? Here it is. Just called Kathleen with Kitty, and it takes place obviously in the middle of winter. An old cat. In a dark house, watching snow slant fast across the street lights to fall, snow on snow on snow, she cuddles her quiet thoughts and the old cat, white as snow, affectionately near death, meow, muted in thrall to snow, temper gentled as they both gaze from the darkness at snow. Sorry, the dog can't accompany it, but now here's one that takes place in the Community and Senior Centre, where I played a lot of pool with my friend Lowell. And of course, when we began, neither of us had played for years and years, so we weren't very good at it. It's called A Late Game. We size up the pool table, my friend and I, both of us creaky from lack of practice, arthritic in certain joints, but keen to test our mettle, as in our earlier days of field sports, girls and parties, locker law and drunken chants. The senior centre's new, and this is our first visit. We buckle down to the game with self-confident vigour. Lowell grinds chalk on his cue. I reverse my cue and twirl it. Then we bang balls at random, missing some altogether. 3 other old geezers are playing in slow motion beneath the wall-hung flat screen where Oprah's at full throttle. They mutter, shit, shot, Jesus, shuffling to take position. One leant on a walking frame, one stiff-legged, one bent double. I feather a cushion ball, the ghost of lost competence guiding my shot, which shrinks from the pocket. Lowell miscues and his ball jumps the table. But I get my comeuppance there and then when he hits form in a potting storm. I lose. The 3 old geezers give up, arguing amicably as they leave, but we play on Through the afternoon's boredom, the centres edge towards sleep round Oprah's celebrity. Only the desk guy stays on for our fumbled final game. And lastly, the last one I'm going to read is a poem I've written over the last few weeks. And again, you can see it's only a short poem, but it's taken me weeks and weeks to get it right. And it certainly means a lot to me because this is the first poem I've written for about a year while I've been recovering from knee replacement surgery, which knocked the stuffing out of me. But when I had it done 8 years ago, it did nothing of the kind. But this time, I suppose, at my age, you know, takes a long time to recover. However, much to my delight, I recently wrote this poem, and it's based upon a big, beautiful tree that stood behind my house. And I was aware that it was decrepit and that big branches were breaking and falling off it from time to time. But still, I was very surprised and shocked when, during my absence in England last summer, they took it away. And when I came back, you know, I could hardly believe my eyes. But this later turned into be something more than it started as. Really, by the end of the poem, it's suggesting that for the living, death opens up new perspectives, I think. The ancient copper beech. No, wait a minute, I've got. The ancient copper beech that shaded my back door has gone without a trace. And yet its spread and soar that hid the power plant, cars parked on an asphalt lot, still haunts my sleep. Its leaves, an oracle, dream begot, whisper of growth, decay, dispatch without ado, life giving way to death, a vacancy to look through. So that's it. Thank you so much.